Yes. So here we are. Two messages. I want to highlight that independence did not provide the political space, and secondly, my own experience. So what is that experience? And very briefly, I started off working in the Ministry of Finance in Jamaica with my economics degree. Um, I worked in St. Vincent in the community-based applied nutrition program with the Commonwealth Save the Children Fund. I helped the government of St. Vincent set up the Community Development Department. And then in the 70s, I helped to set up the Women's Bureau in Jamaica. Towards the end of the 70s, I moved to Barbados, where we set up the Women in Development Unit at the University of the West Indies. And then finally, I became the general coordinator of DAWN, the network of third world women. And I want to say what I learned. First of all, what I learned from these various experiences, and you'll notice that I've had the experience of working with governments and with non-governmental organizations, and also with what I call a women's movement now. You'll notice that I worked at community level, at national level, and regional level, and also with DAWN at international level. And what I learned from that many decades of experience is, first of all, about economics, that neoclassical economics did not take account of the country's dependence on external controls regarding prices, costs of production, etc. And the second very important thing I learned was that the unwaged work of people, mostly women, on which the economy depends, is again not counted in national accounts.
Peggy, can I ask a question? What is neoclassical economics?
Neoclassical economics is mainstream economics. It's the economics that we all learn when we do a degree in economics. It does not take account of power. And so the distinction between neoclassical economics and political economy is really the key thing that I want to emphasize. And the reason that this course is a course in political economy is precisely to underline the fact that neoclassical economics does not take account of the different power relations between countries, between people, between classes, between races, and that in economics, and I said about politics, that power relations are a key factor in decision making. We talked about that in our introductory course as well, but here we are. Power is at the center of everything. And particularly when we talk about women, there's a wonderful quotation from Tanya's module from Nita Barrow about gender as a complex system of personal and social relations of domination and power. Through which men and women are socially created and maintained and given access to or allocated status, power, and material resources in society. So we must remember that power is a really key factor in everything we learn in this course. And what I learned about society is that everything is interlinked, and that to understand what is happening, you have to have an intersectoral and a structural analysis. So in this module, there are two parts now to this module. One part, I'm going to talk about different approaches to Caribbean development. And in the second part, I want to talk about the feminist critique of that current economic model. The framing question, as you saw from the outline, was that how have Caribbean thinkers understood development, and what is the dominant framework that currently directs economic policy? And then finally, how have Caribbean feminists critiqued that framework? So the two approaches to Caribbean development, I would say, I started the post-independence period up to 1984. And then I talk about 1984 and beyond. And I will share with you why I think 1984 is important. So in that post-independence period, we had broad-based socio-economic policies. There were planning units. They emphasized human development as a part of nation building. Remember, we're coming out of colonialism, and all of our governments understood that to build our countries, that we had to start with social development, human development, as a foundation to economic growth. In my notes, I've given a lot of information, drawing very heavily from the work of a Canadian political economist, Carrie Levitt. And there's also the video by Norman Girvan, Critical Reflections in a Time of Uncertainty. Now, Norman's, that video is extremely important. Norman is no longer with us, and he's an icon. He is someone who's centrally engaged in the processes as an intellectual, an academic, a policy advisor, and an activist. And that particular video is something that I want to recommend that you go back to and look at again, particularly as a background to the next two modules, the module next week and the week after, modules 5 and 6. So although I have it here for my module, it has information that you really need to revisit as you prepare for the next volume. And I have these quotations, which I'm not going to read, but I want to highlight why I chose them. The first one, of course, is by Sir Arthur Lewis. He's a St. Lucian Nobel laureate in economics, somebody that we are very proud of in the Caribbean. And he is the person who talked about industrialization. And I think what is really important about this quotation is that he recognized that foreign capital is needed, but that would require a period of what he called wooing and fawning upon such people. And I want you to reflect on whether this is still happening today, what we have to give up in order to appease the bankers, the foreign investors. The second quotation, the reason I chose that, it's by a very well-known Latin American economist, to show that, and this was written way back in the 60s, that although there's an expectation that all the societies of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the third world as we used to call them, must catch up with these industrialized countries and become like them, that even at that time there were people questioning whether that was really desirable. And I think it's a question that we really have to think seriously about now, whether we really need to try to catch up with those countries when those countries have their own share of problems. And the third quotation is from Carrie Levitt, and most of my notes have come from Carrie's book. And I want to mention Carrie particularly this morning because she is in the final stages of her life in Montreal. She has continued her links with the Caribbean. She was a very important member of a group called the New World Group that we'll talk a little bit more about in a while. I have Rosina Wiltshire here with me, and Rosina was part of that New World Group, and Norman also talks about that New World Group. So my first question, and I'm listening out for what you're saying about this, what do you all know about the two post-dependence decades, the decade of the 60s and the decade of the 70s? Now, I recognize some of you are not born then. So there is some personal experience, but what have your parents and grandparents, what has your reading about the Caribbean told you about that incredible period following when our countries first became independent? And so I want you all to jump in here and say something about your own experience. I'm looking to see whose mic is, who wants to speak first. You just need to unmute your mic because I can't actually see. Is it possible to see the?
No, yes, sir.
So who would like to say something about this? Yes? I don't see any microphones unmuted yet. I see many more people have joined us. Adua, Adjua, Tina, Audrey, hi, Audrey's here. Shante, Panya. Yes. Who is jumping in now? Just say your name first.
I could jump in. Nicole from Trinidad and Tobago.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi. Well, I want to kind of jump in early because yesterday.
Sorry, I'm not hearing.
Can you hear me now?
Can the others please mute their mics? Yes, Nicole?
Sure. So yesterday in Trinidad and Tobago, we observed the 50th anniversary of the 1970 revolution. Something that I'm very interested in personally, because I know some of the people who are actually involved. So they talked about the challenges that would have happened with some students in Canada, where
yes,
they
could you say
from
yeah, it's not hearing me. Go ahead.
Repeat that, Peggy.
Yes, I was just wondering if you could say just 2 words about the revolution.
Right, so it was around Black persons getting jobs and being recognized as people within the country, because at that time we still had white or Caucasian folks still in positions in different workplaces. And there were several different acts of microaggressions and also major aggressions around ensuring that everybody in the country was seen as equals.
Yes?
Yeah.
Right, no hearing.
Nobody's speaking. There's a brilliant article by the bishop of the Catholic bishop on the unfinished Black Revolution in Trinidad that was published in the Nation newspaper on Sunday, and in which he talks about that period and the fact that while a lot has changed, there's a lot that remains to happen in order for the real transformation of the Caribbean societies.
Mm-hmm. But I want to go back to the 60s and 70s. So Nicole, you were saying that yesterday was the 50th anniversary, but you didn't say what you remembered or you've heard about the 60s and 70s.
In 60s and 70s, well, for me, lots of, in 60s specifically, the unrest and then the sentiment around what independence would do for both Trinidad and the region. The whole talk around federation, how it would work when Jamaica departed, how everybody else felt, and the, 1 from 10 leaves 0.
Yes.
Conversation. So I think a lot of talk around wanting to be seen as independent nations, and I like the talk what you used around Bob Marley's song, which gave me a different feel for the way the song where I've interpreted the song, and I would definitely think about it from that perspective.
Yes. Well, certainly when I did my degree in economics, when I decided to do a degree in economics, and Norman makes this point, I come from that generation that we really believed that independence would allow us the space to make a better life for everybody. Yeah. So that's what I'm trying to get at in this discussion now. Whether other people have heard about the 60s and the 70s as a moment when people in the Caribbean were excited about the possibilities of what independence would bring. I want to get a sense from participants of whether any of you have been part of a conversation like that. Have you ever thought about it, heard about it?
Good morning, everyone.
Just say your
Hello.
name. Say your name first.
Alexandrina Wong from Antigua.
Hi.
I would like to share my personal experience. I am from that era myself, with Bird and Barrow, and what took place when we heard the statement, oil don't spoil, and also the dissension between Forbes Burnham and Cheddy Jagan, which led to a racial dissension and civil war at that time. So those eras for me, and then in the 70s, what we experienced was a meltdown from the oil crisis, which impacted severely on our leadership, on our economics, on the quality of life, that led to the banning of importation of many goods. There was also the challenge with the bauxite company when we tried to stamp our ownership on that bauxite company. We had to sell to the same people that we were having the challenge with. So our economy and our social life was in complete chaos. I went to bed one night paying $20 for a taxi to take me to work, and the next morning I had to pay $200. So quality of life was severely impacted, and we had different leadership styles from our leaders throughout the Caribbean. I have childhood friends who lost relatives and property. And so we can see right away how our social life was impacted, and how the value of our money impacted on the quality of our lives.
Yes, you make a very important point about the oil crisis, which changed everything. Certainly, it led to a major disruption in all of our economies. I don't know whether anybody from Guyana would like to jump in there, because you've made a reference to the tension between Burnham and Jagan, and that really was about what would independence mean and who would be in control. Anybody from Guyana heard anything about that?
This is Joy. I was about to say Nicola. She carried names. Yes. Morning, everybody. Sorry, I'm not good with names, but while the person was speaking just now, Alexandria is the name. I was born in the 70s, so I mean I can't really relate to much of the 60s and the early 70s. But as a small girl, I grew up in a community that was multiracial, and when we started going to school and we hearing all these racial slangs and so on, I really couldn't relate to it because of the community that I grew up in. But even today, we can still hear people saying, right now we're in the election mode. Next week we'll have our general elections. And people are referring to what happened way back in those days, and why they wouldn't support who, and why you shouldn't support who, and they would never forget this and they would never forget that. So you hear these things all the time, and what part of the problem is that we're teaching our children these things. So the race hate is very much present and is still present in our society today. You could come to the market and see people of all races living and selling food, and when it comes to election time, you want to know what happens.
Joy, I don't mean to stop you, but can you speak into the microphone, please? We are not hearing well.
Better now?
Yes,
Hello?
so just
You hearing me better now?
Yes, that's good.
All right. So, yeah, I'm saying the race hate is still very much prevalent. And even our politicians at this time on all sides are reminding people about things. And to me, we can't talk about independence if we can't really think and decide for ourselves, and if our decisions has to be influenced by another person.
Okay, so anybody else wants to say? What is the time?
Hi, this is Maggie from Suriname. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so I was born in '67 and I was not living in the Caribbean at the time. But what resonates with me is the Bob Marley song, Peggy, because what happened in Suriname is that independence was not really fought for. It's more that Holland had a very painful departing of Indonesia, of their colony of Indonesia. And basically, the biggest profits from Suriname at that time, the bauxite industry, wasn't that relevant anymore. And so basically they kind of wanted to get rid of Suriname. There was an independence movement, but that wasn't that was not in power. There was more, students and people who were discussing with each other. And what happened in the years up to independence is that it became more like a competition between the two biggest ethnical parties, which were the Creole Party and the Hindustani Party. And it was very much like, yeah, who is going to be the deputy? It was not much about what we're going to do for ourselves. It was like, who is going to receive the power and the money from the departing sheriff. And how the media worked the people resulted in, when the Creole Party won, the Hindustani Party had installed such a fear in their people, like saying like, oh, when the blacks win, they will rape your daughters and steal your things and everything, that there was a mass emigration to Holland from mainly the Hindustani people. And up to this day, we still have this ethnical divide that is a very important part of how politics are shaped today.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to bring this particular discussion to a close so that we can move on. But before I do that, I just want to highlight again that the 60s and 70s were a moment of hope, excitement, but also a time of disruption from the oil crisis and the emergence of issues of race and ethnicity. Gayatri made the point that Suriname didn't have to fight for its independence, that Holland was ready to step back. And I want to just underline that for the countries of the English-speaking Caribbean as well. Britain was ready to hand over to Caribbean people. Eric Williams, a famous Trinidadian prime minister, wrote a book called Capitalism and Slavery, in which he emphasized that the reason that Britain was ready to step back was that sugar was no longer profitable. These islands were no longer profitable. And so, yes, indeed, we didn't have to fight for our independence. But I want to say that there have always been struggles in the Caribbean, apart from the slave rebellions, of course, in the 1930s, a wave of riots across the country, people organizing to resist injustice. And I want to mention a particular group that I referred to earlier, the New World Group, because in the 60s, on the campus of the University of the West Indies in Jamaica and Trinidad, there were the first group of economists who were trying to introduce political economy into the economics departments. They were the ones who were saying that we need to rethink our assumptions about development trickling down. And I want to take advantage of Rosina's being here to say a few words of what it felt like at that time in the 60s. How I keep coming back to this, how we organized to live. How we organized to live. There's different moments in the Caribbean. People have come together to try to resist injustice. And here was this group of economists, social scientists, political scientists on the campuses. Rosina, you want to say a few words about that? Norman refers to it, but...
Well, thank you, Peggy. Basically, the New World Group was challenging the foundation of development as based on gross domestic product and introducing development economics. So it was not the somebody asked about the neoclassical. It was moving away from the neoclassical model, just based on money and profit and all people acting on the basis of self-interest, to a development, what was called a development economics, which was economics in the interest of people, equality, justice, and taking into consideration the political dimension, the power dimension that Peggy so eloquently discussed earlier. I will. I would also say that the politics of it was not just internal class politics, but the continuation of the colonial model through other means. Two of the you all mentioned the Jamaican struggle and the Guyanese struggle. Those were not just internal, but I would suggest that you read Cheddi Jagan's The West on Trial, which on the basis of records from the CIA released, clearly showed that Jagan's socialist model was met by the North with intervention and stirring up that racial crisis. And Manley's socialist, democratic socialist model, which again in attempted to integrate the New World development economics framework into planning and policy, was met by North American intervention, which led and use of the IMF debt model to induce the devaluation.
Yes. So Rosina just referred to the Manley period. So in the 70s, definitely from the 60s and 70s, there was that strand of resistance, challenging the assumptions of neoclassical economics, moving towards development economics and political economy. And always there was that pushback. And I want to turn now to the major pushback that took place at the end of the 1970s. In the 70s, for instance, at the United Nations, there were even calls for a new international economic order. So the Caribbean was not alone in calling for a new model of development, a new international economic order that would restore some balance between developing countries as producers of raw material and the industrialized countries. But at the end of the 70s and in 1980, everything changed. Ronald Reagan came to power in the United States and Margaret Thatcher came to power in Britain. And they both basically said, enough of all this talk about justice and new international economic orders, and now let us come back to our neoclassical economics. Let us come back. So the major pushback took place led by Reagan and Thatcher. And what happened in the Caribbean, and we were moving towards that for a while, was a debt crisis. Of course, Jamaica was very indebted, and they had already begun to introduce those policies of structural adjustment. And I want to look now at the Nassau Understanding, because that is one of the readings, and I don't know whether you had a chance to look at it. Some of you might have been put off completely. I was talking to Audrey Roberts, and she said that she didn't even want to read it. But it's a very important document because...
One sec, Peggy. The Nassau Understanding is not showing here.
Right. Yes.
There you go.
Yes. A very difficult document to read, but it's very important that you try to look at it, because it's a reflection of other documents of its kind. There's documents from international institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, our own governments. They all signed on to this structural adjustment as a framework for Caribbean development. And when you read it, you're really struck by the contradictions inherent in the Nassau Understanding. You'll see that what I call the aspirational parts, that there's a lot of talk about the need to strengthen agriculture, promote agro-industries, strengthen planning, machinery, strengthen education and health. And at the same time, they talk about the need for fiscal discipline, budget surpluses. And at that time, there was this tension between all of these aspirational goals, all of these good things, and the reality was the framework of structural adjustment that really tried to reorganize the role of the state. Those structural adjustment policies actually lay the basis of the neoliberalism that we know today. And I want to emphasize the need to look behind the labels to what it actually means, because at the end of the beginning of the 80s, when Reagan and Thatcher came into power, we heard about the Washington Consensus. Now, consensus, the word consensus implies that there's some discussion among people and some consensus, but in fact, the consensus was handed down to us from Washington. And it was handed down in the form of these structural adjustment policies, which really arose as the conditions under which people could get access to support from the International Monetary Fund. It really came out of a debt crisis that started when Mexico was not able to meet its obligations, its international debt. But it soon spread. And in 1984, CARICOM heads of governments meeting in Nassau adopted this document that you have as one of your readings, which basically says structural adjustment is the answer to Caribbean development. I want to ask Audrey to say something about it, because she was, kind of resisting looking at it even. But it's really important, because I'm arguing that 1984 was a turning point. 1984 was the beginning of the kind of economic model that we're seeing today. Norman Girvan talks a lot about it. The elements of that framework, which we already began to hear about in Tanya's presentation, cutbacks in government spending, especially on social services and subsidies, the introduction of user fees, the privatization of services, privatization of water, government assets like electricity, the shift from progressive taxes, income taxes, to regressive taxes, value added. Now, let me just pause there for a moment and say that progressive taxes are more just taxes. They're taxes that tax people according to their income. So the people that earn more income pay more taxes. But these value-added taxes, these sales taxes, everybody pays the same tax. So people that have a lot of money will pay the same percentage on their
Goods and services.
on their goods and services than people that have less money. I was going to say things like rice and sugar, but many of our governments have in fact exempted basic things like rice and sugar and milk from value-added taxes. But we all know that the value-added taxes are paid by regardless of the money that you have. Another element in that framework which is extremely important is deregulation. Deregulation.
Peggy, sorry.
Yes.
I just wanted to say something on the
Who's this?
value-added tax. This is Joy.
Yes, Joy.
As it relates to value-added tax, that
Joy, please speak into the microphone.
Okay, for businesses, right? Businesses big businesses would get tax returns, but in terms of micro businesses, while you're paying tax, you don't get anything, because if you're not earning more than 10 million per year, then you can't get any return, but you're paying tax. So even the big businesses, they're getting something out of it, while the smaller man is being squeezed all the time.
Yes, thank you very much for that. And then, of course, the opening of import markets, free trade. The implications of that, the major implication of that was a reduction and a redefinition of the role of the state in relation to citizens, the privileging of the market or the private sector, and we hear about public-private partnerships, and if you like, maybe somebody could say what that means, and the marketization of governance, as we call it. In Gervin's video, he lists the policy tools that governments have given up in order to satisfy the banks and the foreign investors. And these include closing of marketing boards, the removal of controls on imports, prices, banks, the reduction of tariff protection for industry and agriculture, again, the shifting of taxation. And he talks about 9 interrelated processes that happen as a result of this. And again, when you read the Nassau Understanding, read the Nassau Understanding against these interrelated processes, because you'll find that in the Nassau Understanding, I think it's on, I think it's page, paragraph 6, where they define the problem. Everything they define in 1984 as the problem, which was supposed to be fixed by these policies, have in fact got worse as a result of these policies. So here are the processes that Norman Gervin lists as resulting from the introduction of that particular framework. Economic stagnation, the hollowing out of production, what he calls tradification, that is emphasis on trade, free trade. Remittanceization, that is what is more people depending on remittances. Financialization, a lot of the economy growth now is in financial services, not in the real economy of the production of goods and services. The informalization of the economy, criminalization, people having to turn to drugs and other criminal activities to live. And immigration, of course, a lot of people leaving the country because they can't find work, because of the violence that ensues, and the debt. So it's really ironic that when you read that Nassau Understanding, the statement of the problem in paragraph 5, it basically describes everything that Norman talks about. Audrey, you want to say something about it?
I wanted to ask a question. This is Maggie. The tradification. Could you explain shortly what Gervin means with that?
By what?
Tradification.
Oh, tradification. Well, yes, well,
Oh,
have a look at
trade.
tradification. Tradification. The emphasis on trade, on free trade, opening up of the markets. Before that, you know, one of the things that governments used to be able to do is to protect pioneer industries. They used to have tariffs that protected agricultural production, agro industries, our new attempts at industrialization. Well, with the structural adjustment policies, governments lose control of that altogether. They have to open up their markets, and that is one of the reasons that production, a lot of our industries have just folded, the hollowing out of production.
Right.
Yes, any other questions about that? But I urge you to listen to that video again, because it's really very rich, and Norman explains each of these 9 items. And I didn't want to get into this discussion now, because you will have an opportunity of discussing that in the next module when we have case studies of what actually happened in Jamaica and what actually happened in St. Vincent. And then in module 6, there's a discussion about what is happening now in Barbados. So I deliberately did not want to have a full discussion on neoliberalism now. I simply wanted to draw your attention to that turning point in the Nassau understanding, to ask you to make an effort to look at it and to look out for the contradictions between what they say they want to do, or the good things that they want to do, and what actually happens. In fact, I'm going to write to everybody about this too, but in the next module, I'm going to ask people to say what actually happened in their countries after 1984. Were there any policy changes in your country after 1984? But I don't want us to discuss it in detail now, because I really want us to move on to the feminist critique of this model. But before I do that, Audrey, do you have anything to say about the Nassau understanding? I asked you to read it not because it has Nassau in it, but because you were so offended when I listed it as one of the things to read. Yes, Audrey? The last time Audrey had difficulty with her mic. Can we see the chat? Let's see if Audrey is saying anything. Audrey?
My mic seems to have done it again.
No, I can hear you.
Oh, you can?
I can hear you now. Wonderful. Go ahead, Audrey.
Wonderful. Good. Good morning, all. I just wanted to say I did look at the Nassau misunderstanding, as I call it. And I think, Peggy, well, I agree with you. I think the initial paragraphs certainly indicate an aspirational outlook. And it was like they were trying to reflect on what they know was happening with them, with the region. And yet, the very critique that they seemed to have been making about what was wrong is the very thing they went out and embraced in this understanding that they claim to have created. So it was very troubling to read it, because the language really was a language of, you know, it's like they stepped back into a position of disassociating themselves from the responsibility I think they had, which was to really help all of us in the region to understand what was happening. Remember that this understanding was formed in 1984, when already there were indicators coming from Latin America. The 80s in Latin America is termed as the lost decade. Yeah? And this was also affecting us in the Caribbean. we had already started to feel a great dislocation from what we thought we were doing in the 60s. In the 70s, we were really starting to feel a lot of oppression, economic oppression, and the kind of relationships that we were forming, like Jamaica with Cuba and with Grenada, under democratic socialism, we're starting to get a lot of backlash. So when this opportunity for an analysis of what we were experiencing that should have come from our leaders, our political leaders, and I think, as I said before, the first part of the document shows that they knew something awful was happening under this kind of structural adjustment model. They went back again and on us. They let the people down and said, this is what we must do, all this fiscal, shaping up of ourselves in order to move forward. So it was, to me, a great misunderstanding and a kind of betrayal. I see it as a document of betrayal because they knew they had enough going on around them from the 70s coming now into the 80s and what was going on in Latin America, as you referred to Mexico, to know that we were stepping into a pit.
Yes. Thank you very much, Audrey. I see Judith Weatherburn is here. She's going to be moderating the next module. And so we will come back to full discussion of this again. I wanted us to move on now to the Feminist Critiques. And you have a number of readings, including a reading that Tanya had put in Module 3, and there's a reading in Module 5 from Joan French. But I want to start by talking about the origins of that critique in the Caribbean. And I want to say that, in a sense, telling us another part of my story, in 1984, which was just before the conference in Nairobi that marked the end of the UN Decade for Women, a group of women from Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific met in Bangalore. And we met to talk about our experience of development in the 10 years of the decade. There was no other agenda, but people talked about what was happening. And Audrey, you mentioned that it was Latin America that first experienced the impact of that policy framework of structural adjustment. And it was from the Latin American women that we first heard what structural adjustment would actually mean to women, to people and to women. Other regions talked about their own crises, like militarism in the Pacific and environmental degradation in Africa, the terrible famines in the Sahel, religious fundamentalism in Asia. But as we talked about it, we realized that they were all linked, and they were all linked to the particular, what we call then the growth model. Dawn came up with the concept of reproductive crisis. And I think it's a very, Dawn often comes up with these names, these things that, that is ahead of its time, to note that what this particular framework meant would cause a reproductive crisis. Before I go on to say more about Dawn, I want to say that as a result of that discussion in 1984, coming just a few months after I first heard about structural adjustment, I went to a Dawn meeting, a follow-up meeting in Bergen early in 1985. And at the beginning of 1985, I think it was in April, we were meeting in Bridgetown to prepare for the Nairobi conference, which took place in September of 1985. And I brought the meeting's attention to what structural adjustment would actually mean. By that time, every single CARICOM meeting was prefaced by structural adjustment as the framework within which Caribbean development would take place. And we came up with a statement challenging the governments. It was actually the very first time that I know of that people challenged that framework of structural adjustment. The challenge did not come from the university, did not come from the economists. It came from women attending a CARICOM meeting that was taking place in Bridgetown early in 1985 to prepare for the Nairobi conference. I think I was trying to get a copy of that because it's quite a historic statement, but I want Caribbean feminist activists to know that we were the ones who first challenged those policies. And I want to say something about the characteristics of what I call a dawn analysis. Of course, that's an intersectoral analysis that is being used very widely now. But I'm talking about how it came to us in the Caribbean. The first characteristic is that it's from the perspective of economically disadvantaged women. I think all of our analyses must always start with that experience, because we must recognize the difference in the experience of poor women and those women that have economic advantages. It's an analysis that must always take account of social, cultural, political, economic, and now ecological factors. Most importantly, and it was a rare breakthrough when Dawn did this, to link what is happening on the ground or in these different sectors to the larger policy framework. And in a sense, I think this may be one of the most important things that Dawn contributed, because up until that time, people talked about women in education, women in health, women in housing, women in agriculture, as if these are all separate silos and they were not connected in some way to the larger framework. So let me just give you an example. So we could talk about women in health, but if we fail to note that our governments have a policy framework now that is cutting health services, what is the point of talking about women and health without recognizing that fact? So it's really important to link the analysis to the larger policy framework. That is why I spend so much time talking about structural adjustment and neoliberalism as the framework within which everything is happening. The analysis also links the household to the economy, the personal to the political, and it values women's work. And I want to encourage people again to look at the Dawn website. The work is continuing. There are now several new generations of people from the time that Rosina and I were part of Dawn in the 1990s. The Dawn organized in the 90s to really make a very important contribution to the international discussions that were taking place at that time on environment, on population, on human rights. I want to ask Maria, who is in fact the co-coordinator of Dawn at the moment, working with Gita Sen, who is one of the founding members. And I'm so happy that Maria has joined us in this course. Maria is from the Dominican Republic. Maria, can you say a few words about Dawn at the moment? What is Dawn doing now?
Sure. Thank you, Peggy. And just to say again, what an honor for me is to be part of this training course. And
can you increase the volume or speak into your mic?
Okay, I'm getting closer. Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, thank you. No, I was just saying that it's really an honor to have this opportunity, because as a fellow Caribbean, it's such a different setting and historical background for a country that is so geographically placed so close to you and the English Caribbean islands. So it's very interesting, and interesting also to reflect how even with 500 difference, some of what happened in our independence in terms of that the power wasn't really distributed equally and properly. It's amazing how, you know, history hasn't changed all that much in that sense. So now going back to Dawn, I mean, I'm a very recent member of Dawn in comparison with, obviously, with Peggy as a founder and others. And And my background is not on political economy, but I have learned so much in the past 3 years as a Dawn co-coordinator. And what Dawn is focusing now, which is connected still to this political economy analysis, is in fact on the corporate capture of public policies and the state. And it's like a next step to the neoliberal policies, because now it's not opening the doors to the private sector to benefit from the macroeconomic policies, but it's more of a revolving door where the private sector becomes part of the state and becomes part of the definition of these macroeconomic policies. So in the recent years, Dawn is focusing on that, and also focusing on the use of the Sustainable Development Framework, the misuse, let's say, and the co-optation of this framework that has elements to be revolutionary, but at the end of the day, as I think Peggy mentioned it in one of the former slides, the previous slide, sorry, this framework cannot be actually put in place if at the same time we stick to the neoliberal framework. So until our governments, until all of us as part of the society from social movement, feminist, civil society, don't we come together into challenging that the neoliberal framework cannot coexist with more progressive frameworks that look into economical, gender, social justice. We're not going to advance in sustainable development, for example.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you very much for that. So I want to go on now to the other readings that we looked at, and it's very interesting that the readings by Diane Elson and Stephanie Cicchino both focus on the global economic crisis of 2008. And it's important to note that that crisis, the difference between that global economic crisis of 2008 and the crisis, the debt crisis that hit us in 1980s. And the difference is that in the 1980s, the crisis started in Latin America with, as I said, with the inability of Mexico to pay its debt. Whereas in 2008, it started in the United States with the banks pushing the limits to increase profits. And it's important to see that that toxic framework affects not just developing countries, but the industrialized countries as well. I remember at the time of the economic crisis, I thought, well, now surely they're going to acknowledge that it doesn't work. But of course, that never happened. Elson's article provides a very useful framework, a matrix, and it's particularly useful for people who are doing gender analysis. And I won't say anything more about it because I want us to get to our discussion. So I leave it to those of you who are actually working on policy to look at that article. She concludes the need for sex disaggregated statistics so that we can take, even though that data doesn't take account of women's work or the informal economy, but we need to know how men and women are affected differently. And the need to pay attention to what she calls gender norms, the social practices and the ideas that shape the behavior of men and women and of institutions. The Cicchino article is also focuses on the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. But I think what is very useful about it, and it's a rather large, a rather long article, and maybe not everybody wants to struggle through it, but have a look at the conclusions, because she recognizes that she makes the case really for government regulations of the market. So she's calling for a return to some kind of regulation, because it's the lack of regulations that led to the crisis in 2008. And she financial goals are not ends in themselves. Rather, they are the yardstick by which we should measure the usefulness well, the yardstick by which we measure the usefulness of policies should be their ability to generate well-being, not only economic growth. She also sees that this crisis as an opportunity. And so it's an opportunity to rethink the role of the state. And she gives a number of examples of what the state might do, an alternative approach to dealing with this problem. Raising minimum wage, creating jobs, especially for women, raising the productivity, financing public services. So it's exactly the opposite of the policy framework. She is saying that this policy framework has created problems for people, and what the governments need to do, as Audrey was saying in her presentation, it's an opportunity for the governments to recognize what is happening and to change course. The opportunity for transformation, and I think we've heard that. We may hear that in the Barbados presentation, because the Barbados government likes to talk about transformation. So we will be able to judge whether what does transformation actually mean. So the question of what to do, here I want to remind us of what we saw in Rosina's presentation on different forms of wealth. I want to remind us on what social reproduction is all about. So I've just taken very quickly just to remind us before we get into a discussion of the 8 different forms of capital: social, material. Financial is only one form of capital. And if we emphasize that form of capital, it can often undermine other forms of capital. I want to remind us also of the importance of social reproduction and what social reproduction actually means. And all of that to introduce the discussion that I really want to propose us to end this with. We're not going to discuss neoliberalism, as I said before, because we'll have opportunities in the next 2 modules. So I want us to focus this discussion on the gender dimensions of socioeconomic development. And there are 2 questions. First, how do the interests of women serve those of the larger community, specifically the poor, children, the elderly, the sick, economic growth and productivity, the capacity to survive the effects of climate change? So let us discuss that first, because Judith Weatherburn wrote to me this morning and said that people are still questioning why the focus on gender. What does gender have to do with poverty? What does gender have to do with health? What does gender have to do with economic growth? So I want you to talk a little bit about how do the interests of women serve those of the larger community? Just for maybe about 5 minutes or so.